that I've been keeping up with. I'm still getting close to House of Dragons. Um,
That's ended, right?
yeah, it's ended a while
You've,
back. I think
you've
it ended
watched
2
the
weeks ago.
last episode.
So we talk about
what'd you think overall?
Overall, the show is great. Overall, the show is great. It's definitely up there with peak Game of Thrones, in my opinion. I think that they did a fantastic job of introducing the characters, the world. They had a lot of. I think this was a setup season, intentionally.
I see.
On a couple of different levels because
All right, I guess I'll wait.
you have the whole initial episodes where it's kind of like in the past. Well, I mean, it's all in the past, but they have the time jump where they change characters or they change actors out for older versions of the characters, and so that whole thing is great. But from what I understand, this whole first season is essentially setting up the actual battle that we're going to go into the rest of the show exploring. And so
Hold up, battle within the kingdom?
Yeah, the battle for the throne, basically.
Okay, so here's my thing about this show, and I guess to be fair, I've only got up to I'm on the next episode is gonna be episode 8, so I've only watched 7 episodes.
Okay.
So take that in perspective, and I've heard things get even better, so who knows? But my gripe with this show, and it's just the direction they're taking, is I just feel like this whole battle to be king is so done pettily here. It just
Pettily? Oh no, you're right.
It's
you're
very
right.
petty.
Yeah.
It's very
No, you're absolutely right.
Because the thing with Game of Thrones, and one thing I liked about with Game of Thrones, and I'm not a big fantasy person, whatever, but the big thing that is the thing that Game of Thrones is known for is its politics, right? Like it has all this stuff, but the politics was interesting. And it was just the politics of what is the right way to be a king, like what's the right way to rule a kingdom, right? And my problem with this show, even though fine, it's about the same kingdom, whatever, we don't get the viewpoint of what do they want to be king? It's just I deserve to be king. No, I deserve to be king. No, I deserve to be king.
But I think that's also realistic.
It is. It's realistic, but to me, it's done petty because it's I don't really. Because then at one point it's why do I want to root for this person or why do I root for that person? I mean, the only person I even want to root for right now is Damien, just because Damien is the most interesting character. But that goes back to another kind of gripe I have, where I just feel like a lot of the characters are a little bit more passive, and there's not more characters actually making plans, making decisions happen.
Yeah.
Rather, we're just kind of waiting for events, characters reacting, and then being see, I'm right. Okay, what are you going to do about it? The only character that is doing stuff is Damien. And to me, it didn't seem like after the time skip, he didn't do anything until a certain, I don't want to spoil things, but a certain point where it's okay, this happened. All right, now we're gonna do this plan. So
yeah,
for me, it's just not as compelling to watch that.
I think that's interesting because I get what you're saying, where the motivations for some of these characters to try to get power, it's different from in the original Game of Thrones. I think that they did a good job of trying to establish why these people want power, but I agree with you. It's almost like you're realistically you're weird for rooting for. There's Team Green and Team Black, and you're weird for rooting for Team Green because their reasons are kind of what you just want to be king just because you want to be king.
Yeah,
but I think that's realistic because in real life you have those people with those kind of motivations.
But to me it just feels like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it just feels like I'm watching, it's like Keeping Up with the Kardashian, or in this case Keeping Up with the Targaryens. It's okay, oh, so this Targaryen did this, oh, this Targaryen slept with this person, so because this person slept with this person, I deserve to be king. And it's just too, for me, it's just too petty with what's going on. I would want something more of
I think those elements were still there in the first Game of Thrones.
They were, but again, what I liked about the first Game of Thrones was that, again, it still was a viewpoint. It was still a viewpoint of why, there was more deeper behind why I think this would be the better kingdom. Granted, they may have a petty viewpoint. You can argue Dany's viewpoint of what she thinks is a kingdom is very idealistic. That may not work. But however, you can see where she was kind of coming from with it. As opposed with this, it just seems too. Maybe it's because it's in the same realm and it's not different realms. But it's just like, I would just want something like, hey, if I was Keen, I will make things better here. Like, I think this service is not as great. This is why I believe that, as opposed to, well, you know, I'm a Keen, or I want to be Keen for this reason.
Yeah.
So that's just my thing. It's just
Triku, make sure you move the mic closer to you.
okay.
Because you're kind of talking like this.
Oh my god, that's so embarrassing. My rant is now off.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
But yeah, I think that's my. It's just that's my gripe with it. Like, it's entertaining, right? I do think the performances are well made. Like, I love the actors; they do a good job. I like the cinematography, all that stuff. Like, I will admit, and I know when I first talked about it, I was kind of like I thought the plot was kind of weak. But now, as I'm taking my bias aside, I will admit that like I enjoyed this season is still enjoyable to watch, and I still want to see it. I just think that as far as direction wise and where I'm going to, it's just, for me, it's a little bit like, I would want it a more, especially since people are comparing it to Game of Thrones, I would want it a more stronger story dynamic behind their motivations, and even just them not being as passive and characters actually taking, like, for example, with Rhaenyra's character, her whole biggest like gripe she had was like, she didn't want to be, you know, she wanted to be queen, but she didn't want to get married. I would have rather see her doing all these kind of plans of like, okay, what's her plan around that? Like her trying to do something, her failing, and then being like, okay, I have this opportunity where this guy who's not really into women, I can just be with him, have my lover, and get the kingdom. Like, I would rather have that than it just being like, she's just like, oh, I don't want to be Keen. This is why I hate being Keen. Run. And then eventually one moment, oh, this guy is not really into women. Hey, you know what? I'm going to marry you, and then I'm going to have my side thing, and I'm going to have, like, I would have rather have that. And I just feel like those elements, story-wise, make it kind of lacking there. But overall, as a show, like, it's not a bad show. I'll never say it's a horrible show. It's an entertaining show, and I'll give it that. Like, I do enjoy the performances. I do enjoy when they do have action. I do, like it's good. It's good. It's just those areas is where, like, whenever I hear people say it's like Game of Thrones at its best, I'm like, there's something you're missing about Game of Thrones. You know, it's like, to me, it's like if someone were to compare Teen Titans at its best with Young Justice at its best, where it's like, oh, Teen Titans is just like Young Justice. Well, there's actually this nuance of the story where Young Justice has a little bit more depth, but Teen Titans, granted, it's an entertaining show. So that's just how I feel about House of Dragons. But again, I'm gonna preface and say I've only seen 7 episodes out of what, 10?
Yeah. Did you get I mean, I don't know, I don't want to do spoilers, so I don't remember exactly what
the last part I
is.
saw was
Spoilers.
I guess I'll say somebody's, I won't go details, but basically somebody got their the kid got his head, or one of the kids got their things aren't off, and then
somebody
they used
got an eye missing.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the thing. That was the last part I
Okay.
saw, and then what's her face got to marry her uncle. So we'll get there.
All right.
So that's the last part I saw. So I'll keep that. But as far as just,
I think that I think your criticisms are valid, of course. I think that it's just the way that I would describe it is this. So Game of Thrones had a lot of, you know, positives going for it, where we have, I think it was easier to sort of empathize and identify with specific characters who are going for a certain goal. Whereas with this show, it's not as clear cut in my view. It's not as clear cut for different characters. And but the thing with me is that I never really liked a lot of the characters in the original Game of Thrones. I love them, of course, but I never like identified with them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I never really rooted for anybody in the original Game of Thrones except for Arya. She was like the only character that I was like, oh, I want Arya to win. And so for me, and that was especially relevant.
That's surprising to me, actually.
That was especially relevant after Ned Stark died. But I think I knew that. I think it was spoiled for me that Ned Stark died.
Oh, okay.
So I was kind of expecting that. So it wasn't
like, weren't you rooting for him though?
I mean, in a philosophical sense, yes. But I think knowing that he dies kind of took away that.
Okay.
Like, you didn't want Robb to win?
I think Robb.
I feel like I was like,
Robb was
Starks all the
cool.
way.
The Starks,
Yeah, me too.
The Starks were great. Robb was cool. I mean, it's hard for me to think back to that time when I was watching it, but I was mostly just in on Arya, and I think
She's a Stark.
yeah, Arya Stark. Yeah. I don't know if I would have to rewatch and to understand. Maybe this is where I would have critiqued Robb's decision making in a specific area or something like that.
He definitely had his faults. He's like,
Right.
let's kill the Karstark. Cause a rebellion in my troops.
Yeah. So, but I see what you're saying. I don't necessarily see that as hindrance in my enjoyment of the show. But that's just where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I guess to further on with that, it's not like I need a character where I really agree with.
Yeah, I don't really like, even with this, like, even Daemon is cool, but there's not really any character in House of the Dragon that I'm like, at least in the way that I was with Arya, that I'm like, oh, go. Man.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like I need so much of a character like that. To me, it goes back to, like, again, I guess it's like the engagement of the story where it's like, you know, I just think for the reasons of why they're doing it, and then we don't have a proactive, especially with if there was a proactive push where it's like, okay, this person has their scheme, this person has that scheme, and they do have this. It's not to say that they don't. Like, I'm not making it absolute. Like, there is moments where they do characters do their schemes. It's interesting. However, the fact there's a lack of it, it's like, that's what to me makes it less compelling, because then it just becomes a repetitive argument of like, oh, this is why it's like, it's always like almost the same argument again. It's like, this thing happened, this is why I deserve to be king. This thing happened, this is why I deserve to be king. But nobody doing any, okay,
you know what it is. So it goes to the king during this era. What's his name? Viserys.
Yeah, horrible king, by the way.
Exactly. No. I have the same opinion. It's like he's not a good king. He tries to be noble. He tries to be like this noble character. I think in some ways he's like kind of what Ned Stark would have been as a king, in some ways.
Yeah.
But just not without as much strength.
Yeah.
And I think that ends up being his downfall and the downfall of his entire family and what leads to the war that's coming. So
yeah.
I don't know. I think that his character being so tragic is kind of the driving force behind why I'm interested in the show.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I have overall been really really enjoyed the first season.
Okay, yeah. I guess that's what it is. I guess to me, it's just, if they're gonna give me sort of this petty reason, I would prefer a more proactive scheme towards actions. Because then from there, or better yet, if it's gonna be really this petty, I would prefer it to be more of like a dramedy, where it's like this is this ridiculous sort of, you know, exaggerated, like it's almost like with Dragon Ball, where it's like, oh, I want the Dragon Ball so I can have a bigger butt. Like, it's like, we know it's ridiculous. It's not this thing where they want me to take this dramatic thing where it's like, you don't know the struggle, what it's like to have a low butt and all this kind of, like, it's like, if you can give me something to balance the pettiness, but it just didn't really do that much other than the performances. And I gotta admit, again, the performances are that good that they can sell a petty reason and make me feel some emotional, you know, something towards it. But it's just, that's just, for me, I guess it's just the Game of Thrones comparison. If I didn't look at it as Game of Thrones, I probably would have a more respect towards it. But when I'm comparing this to Game of Thrones or any, you know, brilliant art storytelling, for it to have these sort of minor flaws do kind of take me out of it, and it's just kind of like
I feel like your problems with it are compelling me not to watch.
Okay, again, I mean, everyone has different opinions. Everyone has different opinions. You may enjoy it, like, you know what I'm saying. I guess.
Yeah, but you know me. It's like if characters have petty reasons to do things and like their character motivations are like very weak, I can't get behind that.
Yeah,
it's very difficult for me.
I don't think their motivations are weak. I don't think that's the same thing as saying that it's petty.
Yeah,
I think that's a different thing, because somebody's motivation for self-aggrandizement, self-interest is still a strong motivation if it's done well. I think it's just that you're viewing it as petty because it's selfish for some characters.
Well, it's not just selfish, but I think for me, it's just, one, it's selfish, but two, I would like to know like what would be the alternative. That's the thing.
There's a realistic element to where I don't want to get too deep into spoilery land, but Otto, the character Otto, he kind of forces his family into this scheme. Like against their will almost. Yeah. And then they grow up in it and they kind of are now forced to go along with it. Otherwise they might get themselves killed if they don't. And it was all because of like one man's selfish ambitions.
Okay.
That kind of, and then now their whole family is like kind of forced to drive on this lane because otherwise they might, die if they go off. So there's kind of there's that element to it. So I wouldn't call it weak motivation. I would say that the element of the motivation is there. Yeah. It's just that you can argue and it's realistic to say that they really don't have a legitimate claim that they're fighting for.
Exactly. That's the thing.
It's their claim is not legitimate, but I don't think that means the motivation is weak.
Yeah, I agree with Osi on that. It's not like it's completely weak, and like obviously there's situations where it's like life or death. So it's understandable. I guess for me, again, when we think about Game of Thrones or we think about stories in general, it's just like, if it's like to have that kind of like, oh, this is why I just want power, for me to not have an alternative where it's just like, oh, this guy sucks, therefore I deserve to be the king. Yeah. That's kind of uncompelling. That's what it is.
We'll see what happens. I think I'll watch it eventually. Yeah. It's just right now.
Exactly.
You've got 2 years before the next season, so
I'm chill with the anime.
That's another one of those. That's another one of those I hate when they just like.